All right, well, Gary, and good afternoon, everybody doing? Halfway through our it's if I speak here, yeah? Okay, I'll stay close to these mics. Okay, so again, thank you, Chairman Zhang and Haier, for the hospitality. It's a real honor to be here with you today. And, you know, this session really is aimed at getting real about the concept of the microenterprise. We've talked about it, several speakers talked about it this morning. In a way, it's the fundamental building block of the Haier model. And we want to unpack that and really try to understand what it feels like to be part of an ME, you know, and how that is different from the experience someone might have at a traditional company, you know, like Samsung or LG. And to help us answer these questions, I'm delighted that a couple of ME owners have agreed to share their stories. So we have Lu Kai-lin, who's the founder of the Thunder Robot Microenterprise that we heard about earlier today, and Mr. Song Baoai, who is the CEO of the Shungang ME, which also was mentioned by Chairman Zhang earlier today. So we'll be able to go deeper with them. And I really thank you in advance for being here. And before, though, we hear from Mr. Lu and Mr. Song, I just wanted to take a few minutes and provide a bit of context around the idea of organizing a company around a set of entrepreneurial units. Because this is a concept that actually has been around for some time, and recently it has, you know, gained quite a bit of popularity. So I pulled this, and Jeff, you might remember this. This is a feature article in Fortune magazine, which is the leading business magazine in the US, if not the world. You would agree, I hope. And, you know, it's about this aspiration. Like, we want to have startups inside large companies. And literally every CEO we talk to would share this aspiration. They want this, right? And they're trying to create this. But as Gary said earlier, you know, the data shows that this is an aspiration that isn't realized in most places. You know, so when you see data like this, where only 7% of people would tell you that it's easy to start a new business or start a new team, 93% say that it's not. And if you actually look at the data of frontline people, this is an aggregate of CEOs, managers, and the like, it's even lower. Then you start to think, well, you know, how easy is it to have startups in large companies? Or even if you look at this other data, which is around, you know, people working in teams. This is drawn from European data that Gary mentioned earlier. You know, we classified whether people work in teams or not and how autonomous the team is. And even if you're very generous about granting autonomy to teams that people are part of, only 11% would tell you, yeah, you know, we're in a team where we can decide what to do, appoint our own leaders, and set our own targets. So it's a very, very small minority. And we've looked at this data for like 20 years, and this hasn't moved an inch, a centimeter. It's stuck in this mode. So this is a little dispiriting, to be sure, but there are rays of hope for sure. Haier provides a great model, but we have also come across, as Polly pointed out, a few other companies that are in the vanguard and that have made progress in turning their organizations into entrepreneurial platforms. And one example that I'd like to share as an interesting comparison and maybe as a setup for our conversation with Mr. Lu and Mr. Song comes from Amazon.com. I'm sure many of you are familiar. They're one of the world's largest retailers and probably one of the most customer-centric companies on the planet. And like Alibaba in China, they've leapfrogged many traditional retailers and have done incredibly well, right, in terms of their success. This is just an indicator, which is their share price that has increased 1,000% over the last 10 years, more than 10 times the average for the market, and certainly more than their competitors like Walmart. And Amazon succeeded by expanding beyond the original model of selling books online to building an ecosystem, very much like Haier aspires to do and is doing, that really leverages their core skills and assets in very innovative ways, right? So just to give a few examples, they introduced physical products like the Kindle Reader and Amazon Echo. They've entered food retailing, and most interestingly, with the acquisition of Whole Foods Market, which is the largest organic retailer in the United States. And just as a quick aside, I remember in one cold October morning, I think of 2010, accompanying Chairman Zhang and a few other leaders from Haier to Whole Food Market's flagship store in New York to benchmark their practices, because they were held up as a very interesting company. And all I can say is, like, what a difference 7 years makes. Right now, they're part of Amazon. Who would have imagined that, right? But they've been incredibly productive and innovative. They've gone beyond retailing. They've entered the content management and production business. They have a studio that makes award-winning movies and content. They introduced a number of clothing brands, becoming one of the largest apparel retailers in the United States, and they've opened up a new brand just a few days ago in Europe. And they've started a business called Amazon Web Services that really leverages their expertise in cloud services and sells it to third parties. And this, over the course of the last 7 years, has basically become the global leader. They've essentially created this industry. They own 40% of the market. And so they're the dominant player. And if you add up the next three players, which are IBM, Google and Microsoft, they have a 23% share combined. So they're just a giant. And their estimated market value is $180 billion. So they're basically as big as Oracle. And they account for about 40% of Amazon's market value. And we'll get to this a little bit later, but this was Amazon's version of an incubating ME. This started from a couple of teams that decided to offer these kinds of services and became an enormous part of Amazon's business. So it's pretty staggering what they've done. And, how have they been able to show so much innovation and adaptability? And, we believe that at the core of this is the company's approach to structuring work around small, agile, entrepreneurial teams, very much like Haier. And I wanted to break down a few of the key features of how they manage these teams and how they're structured. And I'm going to focus in particular on their e-commerce platform and Amazon Web Services and how they run their teams. It's a different story, as we'll see, in other parts of the company, but it's instructive nonetheless. So, these parts of Amazon are powered by several hundred teams, over 1,000, and each are focused on a very specific, limited scope service, like pulling pricing information or inventory information for a particular product. They call these microservices, so it's kind of an interesting analogy to the microenterprise, right? And these microservices are combined together to provide a complete customer experience. So for instance, if I go to Amazon's webpage and I'm interested in buying Haier's portable washer, right, and I pull that page is displaying output from a number of different teams that are responsible for different aspects. So there's one team responsible for displaying reviews of that product, another team focused on the pricing and inventory information, and another one that groups similar items and displays them for the user to see. So each of these elements work together to create something that is complex, rich experience for the user, but they're all managed by distinct teams. If you pull up their homepage, Amazon's homepage, that's 200 to 300 different microservices being loaded, and that's 200 to 300 different micro teams essentially getting engaged in that process. So these teams all operate in a very interesting way. So they're all cross-functional, so it's not just the developers, but they have operations people and business people. These teams are all small, 10 people or less. They call them two pizza teams because that's about as many people you can feed with 2 pizzas. And they all operate under the very, I think, important principle of you build it, you run it, right? So they have end-to-end accountability. They're not delivering a product and throwing it over the wall to someone else. And by being responsible for delivering and running the service, they're also in direct contact with the customer. So they're constantly collecting signals and feedback from customers on what matters most. And this is very much in the spirit of Haier's zero distance, right? So they have zero distance to the customer. And the surface area of the company is maximized because all these teams are mapped against external customers, or in some cases internal customers, but they're all very much focused on the user. of their service. And teams also have a lot of discretions on which tools to use, how to organize works, and how to evolve their services. The only two main directives are, you got to meet your target, and it's a very aggressive target, as in the case of hire, and you have to take care of the interdependencies between your team and the other teams, because these teams obviously all work together. I mean, they're not completely separate from one another. And these interdependencies are managed in a variety of different ways, but I'm going to call out a couple which I think are very interesting. One is through application programming interfaces, or APIs. And APIs are essentially a list of commands that one program sends to another. For instance, pull a particular piece of data or display a particular image. So all Amazon teams operate services that communicate with each other through these APIs. And APIs govern any kind of sharing. So if the marketing team wants product data from a product team, they can't go talk to them or corner them in the hallway. What they need to do is hit the product team's API and get the data that way. And Jeff Bezos is famously issued an edict that basically said, if you don't turn your service into an API-enabled service, you won't stay on the platform. You will be fired, right? So everybody has kind of gone on that train, and it's made a really big difference. The other thing that really helps coordination between these teams is service level agreements. So Amazon is a very information-centric company. They gather lots of data. I don't know if they have 55,000 KPIs. They probably don't have that many. But pretty much anything that can be measured is subject to an SLA. So for instance, the time that is between uploading an image of a product and the time that product is displayed on the page, that's subject to an SLA. Or the amount of lag time in reflecting a change in inventory, that's also subject to an SLA. So APIs and SLAs, create consistency and leverage across the teams while minimizing some of the transaction costs that we heard about earlier in the day. And when I read about these and talked to Amazon people about these, I was very much reminded about Hire's VAM agreements, right? They are, in essence, Hire's version of APIs and SLAs. They allow these different units to come together and form a coherent whole. And lastly, these teams are part of an evolving ecosystem. They can start quickly, they grow, they split, they're like cells in the body. And in a way, you read and hear people at Amazon talk about their organization, their paradigm isn't necessarily the quantum physics, but it's about biology. They think of themselves as a living organism that evolves over time. And this is very much part of their life. Teams can bring a new service in 10 to 15 days. They test it with customers. If it works, it launches. And if it becomes very successful, it becomes a bigger unit and with subunits underneath. So very much like cellular division. And the interesting thing, I mentioned Amazon Web Services earlier. I think the most remarkable thing for me about that part of Amazon is that it didn't really start from Jeff Bezos's mind. He didn't say, let's get into the cloud computing business. It was literally the work of mid-level engineers deep inside Amazon who said, we should be able to create ways to offer computing power on demand and file sharing for Amazon teams and perhaps even outsiders. And that's amazing how a $180 billion business started very much from the ground up. The last thing I'd like to say about Amazon before we pivot and talk a little bit about the higher microenterprises is that they really didn't stumble on this model. It came from a very deliberate choice and philosophy on the part of their leaders to create an environment that supported entrepreneurship and minimize bureaucracy. And I wanted to share this quote from Amazon's Chief Technology Officer, Werner Vogels. Right? So he says these services or teams, have very strong ownership, they're very small, very focused, and this makes it easy for them to innovate, to try new things, right? They are startups within the walls of a bigger company. So this is, the headline, right, of that Fortune magazine. They're making this happen. And this requires a strong focus on who their customers are. And I'm sure that anybody who's familiar with the Hire model, works at Hire, we could have put, Chairman Zhang or other people as authors of this quote, and you would recognize this as being very much part of your fabric as well. And I don't think it's a coincidence. All right, very good. So we think Amazon provides an interesting comparison to Hire, and there are a lot of parallels. You know, they have small teams, very accountable for well-defined products and services. They're connected to each other with clear interfaces and the like. But you know, we would argue that Hire has gone farther than Amazon because they've pushed this model across the entire business. In the case of Amazon, you know, this works in their e-commerce platform. It works in Amazon Web Services. But if you go to a warehouse that Amazon operates, you know, not so much, right? They manage those parts of their business like Taylor would have asked them to do, you know, just now with much more information. So instead, at Hire, you know, the microenterprise model has been applied to all parts of the company: logistics, factories, and there are internal markets for services that, you know, you don't find at Amazon. So we think that even though this is an interesting kind of inspiration or comparison point, you know, there's a lot of value in understanding in greater detail how microenterprises Hire work. And so we have two Emmy owners who kindly agreed to share their own experiences. And we have, I think, a very good mix for this session. One of the Emmy owners is Mr. Lu. He is the founder of the Thunder Robot Enterprise. And then we also have Mr. Song, who is and is an incubating Emmy microenterprise. And then we have Mr. Song, who is the leader of a transformational Emmy, Shungang. And what we're going to do is ask him to come up on stage. So Mr. Song and Mr. Lu, if you wouldn't mind coming up. And we're going to let them speak for 5 minutes each, and they're going to tell us, you know, what they do and how it feels to lead one of these microenterprises, how different it is from a traditional company. And then we'll do some Q&A, and we'll maybe probe deeper on some of the aspects they raised in their opening remarks. So please come up on stage, and please